Now, for the past few months, I've been running a series on William Bartley's book, The Retreat to Commitment. And if you're lucky enough to get your hands on a later version of this book, on the later editions, it is twice as long as the earlier ones. It now comes with 6 large appendices at the back. And as I said in the last few podcasts, these appendices are by far the most interesting part of the book. And in Bartley's own words, they take the book to what he calls a new dimension. In many ways, he's answering the criticism of people he sees around him, some directly, some indirectly. But he is answering all the concerns people had with his original philosophy and his attack on critical rationalism. He's also answering some important questions about why he wrote the book in the first place. What is the problem he's trying to solve? And the first of these 6 appendices is called A Meta-Context for Rationality. And as I said throughout the series, I think Bartley's influence on Popper went largely understated. And I think this is perhaps something to do with the dispute that they had, not just about the particulars of the philosophy, but on what I imagine a trend would be for a lot of the disciples of Popper, a lot of the students of Popper, which is whenever they correct something within Popperian philosophy, and it gets adopted then back into Popperian philosophy, the person who tends to get credit is Karl Popper. And the names such as Bartley here, or Agassiz, or Jarvie, or someone like David Miller, tends to slip away a little bit within the long scheme of things. And I think this particular appendices is a good example of that. I believe in this particular section, he really is dealing with that question, which I suspect came back at him a lot, which is just what is the problem you're seeing here? Sure, there may be a logical dispute here, a logical incongruity, but in the real world, what are you worried about? Exactly. Anyway, he begins the chapter by breaking down the problem of rationality into 3 distinct problems. First, the problem of the logical limits of rationality. Second, the demarcation problem of rationality. And third, the problem of the ecology of rationality. Now, the first 2 of those are going to be handled in the later appendices. And a lot of the logical principles and a lot of the attacks that came back at Popper, the specifics of the logic, are going to be handled there. This is a much larger view, this particular appendices. It handles what Bartley begins to call the meta-context of rationality. At other times, of course, he calls it the ecology of rationality. And call it what you will, but I think ecology is a better way to easily access just what Bartley is getting at here. Ecology is, of course, the relationship between organisms and their environment, and perhaps more specifically, how they survive within that environment. If you think about the human environment, for example, it contains people and plants and animals and objects and chemicals, and the list runs on and on. But it also contains abstractions, ideas and patterns of thought. They are part of the environment, but they're of a different kind to everything else. Bartley wants to break them down 4 ways. He begins with positions, which is a variety of descriptions and a variety of recommended ways of behaving. And then secondly, he has a variety of contexts for these positions themselves. Next, he has criticisms and objections to those various positions. And lastly is that issue of metacontextuality, the context of context. Now, the human eco-niche, as he calls it, is one where people hold conflicting positions and they fight and they argue and they criticize. And of course, they also criticize across certain contexts. An example he uses, and of course, for anyone that's forgotten, Bartley uses as his foil in all of this, the reform movement of Protestant thought in the last century. And the position he has here is one that people will understand pretty quickly here. The 2 examples he puts forward is the human soul is immortal, or perhaps abortion is wrong. And these are positions that exist within the context of Christianity. But of course, they run across context. You may find similar examples and similar principles and similar positions within Buddhism, Hinduism, humanism. These contexts that hold these positions are belief systems that include ideologies and traditions, institutions. But the context itself is not simply an adding up of those particular positions. It's not a sum of its parts. But rather, and here is your pre-echo of what's about to come from Popper and the influence Bartley is going to have on him, the framework and the sensibility in which all these things are crouched and expressed. A framework that casts context over every statement that's uttered within it, and a framework that makes it perhaps incompatible with others. The example Bartley uses here to explain the significance of these frameworks is this. He talks about strawberries, and he imagines himself sitting in his own study looking at a bowl of strawberries. He says, as I read, I take one, and I think to myself just how satisfying the taste is and how nice it is to eat it. He says to himself, and this is the quote, this strawberry is so sweet. He says, just imagine the exact same experience, or a very similar experience, but in a Zen tradition, a Zen framework. And this is the fable of a samurai stuck on a bridge. The bridge is collapsing over a deep ravine. He knows he's going to die, and he's savoring the moment. He reaches out to pluck a wild-growing strawberry, which is just accessible on one of the banks, and says the same thing, this strawberry is so sweet. You can see from that the importance of the framework in which we see the world, and how that framework changes everything within it. The most common way people interact with these frameworks is to find their own identity within the world. They form an allegiance to certain positions or certain ideologies, and these ideologies are sponsored or gratified within that particular context. From that, allegiances flow towards them and vice versa. However, it's not always so easy to separate or distinguish between someone's context and their position. Two may be much more closely related than it might appear. A good example of this is often politics, where a political leader or a politician of any kind may shift their party for a position which has in fact taken on a contextual character. And this is where that identifying issue comes into play. If this particular politician has set political ambition as the context for his life, then the selection of a party is nothing more than a position within that context. It's a kind of justificationist meta-context, and one that Bartley writes always when you see it in the world smacks as disloyalty. Rationality, on the other hand, is the search for knowledge and particularly a critical attitude. And so, as far as tends to be seen, it's not really a matter of position or context. There is nothing intrinsically rational about any particular position or context, including that particular context, which is called rationality itself, or rationalism. In fact, most of the time when you bump into a context of this kind, it in fact hinders the thing it's trying to achieve. The context of rationalism, as we went through in the previous podcast in this series, Bartley sees as limiting rationality, whether it's traditional rationality, or whether it's critical rationalism, or any other variety. And so I hope you can begin to see here that Bartley is building up the problem, this contextual problem, that his particular pancritical rationalism solves. So it actually is more than simply a logical dispute. And this is something that, in Bartley's own words, caught him by surprise. He, in some ways, took for granted that people understood that this meta-context was incredibly important for rationalism. And yet he goes on to write that after writing the book, and before adding these appendices, that the whole rational world barely noticed how important it was. And that is why they so badly misunderstood just what his book was about, and just what the issue he saw was. Without a discussion of metacontextuality, you can't even begin, in Bartley's words, to characterize the nature of the most fundamental differences between men. One cannot define the way in which they differ, but the ways in which they differ. In fact, Bartley goes on to say that most writers never even get close to a discussion of this kind. Bartley uses briefly here a foil of the humanist movement, and he writes how it had a myth of its own mission, but lacked a myth of its origin, which it needed. Now, the rationalist tradition, on the other hand, has a founding myth, a meta-context that looks something like a contrast between the ideas found within the pre-Cratic schools of the Pythagoreans and the Ionians. The Pythagoreans developed a second-order tradition about the importance of passing on doctrines, those doctrines that were put in place by the founders of the school itself. And this meta-context had the effect of limiting change, of course, and restricting the development of the ideology. Whereas the Ionians, by contrast, of course, championed different viewpoints, and as wide a different viewpoints as possible. Here, the meta-context and the second-order tradition is developed by criticism itself, and by trying to improve upon the doctrine. Instead of being faithful, they want to get closer to truth. So far, Bartley thinks that there's been three particular meta-contexts as they've passed down through generations in relationship to rationality. The meta-context of true belief, or justificationist philosophy. This is the Pythagorean tradition. Then there's the Oriental meta-context, as he calls it. This is a meta-context of non-attachment, a non-attachment to all positions and all contexts. And Bartley's going to get into that a lot in just a second. The third meta-context is, of course, fallibilism. This aims to improve upon positions and context. And as Bartley believes, and as I explained in the earlier podcasts, that for most Western philosophies, and most epistemologies, including Poppers, they hinge upon a justificationist approach. This last fallibilist meta-context belongs only to pancritical rationalism, only to Bartley's philosophy itself. The only philosophy, as he sees it, the only epistemology, as he sees it, that doesn't hinge upon justificationism. It is the only philosophy that allows itself to take extreme risks, and all risks, with its own philosophy. It's not concerned about strengthening philosophy, which he still thinks critical rationalism does, by being fearful of criticism, for example. It is only within pancritical rationalism that you'll find no attempt anyhow to justify, to verify, to confirm, to affirm, to strengthen, to validate, to vindicate, make certain, show to be certain, make acceptable, cause to defy or defend in any way. And of course, he thinks that a lot of this entanglement, some of the mistakes that philosophy made, and just how deep justificationism got within philosophy and as well as science, is that Western science took the path of the Pythagoreans. And he believes if it actually did take the path of the Ionians, it might just have got around to avoiding justificationism at all. instead of growing up in the tradition of justified true belief. Now, the extreme to this is, of course, that other meta-context that he calls the Oriental meta-context. This is of non-attachment. In this, he includes Buddhism, Hinduism, and other yogic traditions, all of which, of course, oppose attachment to anything and everything. Bodies and habits, wishes, lusts, craving, aspirations, ideas, beliefs, ideologies, relationships, affiliations. It's a philosophy that looks at the Western context and sees it as one that builds positions and contexts and belief systems, all so that people can then identify themselves with and commit to, after which they can then justify themselves by. And of course, by identifying with a position, you automatically become positional. You orientate yourself towards the world in order of that position, in order of that context. This concept of attachment and the Western idea of commitment, in which Bartley has written this book against, and the tendency to return to it, are very similar. These both look like addictions, people who have given themselves up to a certain practice. And of course, nowhere is the chasm between Western thought and Eastern thought, or Oriental thought, as Bartley calls it here, so evident as in this issue of non-attachment. Now, of course, some writers, even in the Eastern tradition, talk about a true self, or a true identity, or a context of context, in which all identities and ideologies and even meta-contexts emerge, perhaps flourish, and then decline. But I think the point still remains here, and Bartley is onto something. It is a commitment to the belief system that matters, and that is so pernicious. Identities and contexts, they really help to define who we are in the world, and people get value out of them. But they don't really determine who we are and what we are. They only repeat that we are attached to them. The point being that an identity, and a fixed identity, is a liability. The more fixed you are within a particular identity, the less experience you're capable of. The real point of this and this non-attachment movement is not about a lack of a context, but really the push not to be positional in any way, not to be attached and committed. Bartley thinks that two Western writers came close to seeing this, Hermann Hesse and Hermann Koestling. Two writers that he believed pushed beyond this protean form, refused to place exaggerated value on any particular thing, any particular part of themselves, any particular part of identity, context or phenomena as well, and really open themselves up to experience whatever it may be, without judging it before it arrives. They imagine an enlightened individual as someone who's beyond prejudice, and beyond principles, and beyond dogmas. And of course, remembering this, Bartley thinks that critical rationalism has a dogma at the heart of its enterprise. And I think this is often a slur that is pushed towards Eastern philosophy, which is a kind of what Bartley refers to here as identity diffusion. And it's not that at all. It's not a state of disorderliness or confusion. It is simply someone refusing to accept dogmas and contexts as they come. Now, Western skepticism does, of course, a similar thing. In Bartley's words, it arches its brows at all attempts of knowing, and all formulations and definitions and identifications, including its own position, as it should. It's something that bears itself out of the defeat of justificationism. It rejects attachments as well, but not out of the quest for non-attachment itself, but really in search of internal contradiction. None of this magisterial language that you'll discover within this non-attachment philosophy, you're not going to find any of it within the work of Hume, for example. Skepticism is a defense, a simple defense against uncertainty in most ways. So there is a distinction here between Western philosophy, the context, the meta-context of Western philosophy, and this meta-context of non-attachment, of Eastern non-attachment. And it is still there, it is still different. It takes a step away from the philosophies of Popper and Xenophanes, and even the pancritical rationalism that Bartley will discuss in his book and as we discussed in this podcast. It is fallibilism that provides that third meta-context and offers a way for us to judge our progress through, fallible criteria and the distortion of all the forms and contexts that we discover. Sure, it is true, as the Oriental approach, the non-attachment philosophy will show, that language and language systems can mesmerize us and trick us and solidify us in certain positions that we didn't know we held or that we wouldn't want to be holding. But Bartley wants to say something else. He wants to say that it's language that always allows us to step beyond this as well. It permits us to disassociate ourselves and attach and to break the connection between the world and our positions and our hypotheses. By stepping back, we can make these positions, these ideas, into objects, not subjective states, and to not identify ourselves with them. Therefore, they can sit beyond us as objects that can be examined through language. It is possible, as the fallibilists do, to, reject identification and commitment and positionality, and yet at the same time champion, as Bartley goes on to say, the growth of knowledge and a rational way of life. If the goal is to transcend ourselves and the mistakes and the ingrown mistakes that we don't really see, or all the attachments that we're not really sure we have and always stumbling back into, then the rationalist, the fallibilist, will say that the most likely way to actually transcend ourselves is through fallibilism. And we can make progress in this way, a type of progress that doesn't need commitment at all, simply an encouragement of criticism and competition. I mean, it's certainly true that one must detach themselves from a theory in order to analyze it and criticize it and try to improve it, to take that step back, step away from subjectivity. That very question that critical rationalists and Popperians, and of course Bartley himself would advocate, that question of how might my theory be wrong, under what conditions might my theory be wrong, is just such a step. And it is a step that invites a psychological detachment. You are objectifying the theory and taking a step outside the point of view of the theory itself. And of course the Oriental philosophy and the fallibilist philosophy, they seek detachment for different reasons. I've hinted at a few just there. At its core is this: Oriental philosophy seeks to attain a distance from all models of the world, no matter what they may be, all context, all positions, and to from that process, win a kind of freedom. You can be at peace and free of illusions of all kind, and the suffering that comes from attachment. The fallibilist is seeking the growth of knowledge, and perhaps more specifically, a more adequate model of the world itself and the universe. And in this way, of course, what the both philosophies seek are different. So Bartley has laid down his framework there for what his philosophy is and what it isn't. And he's answered many of the criticisms that came his way, or at least perhaps some of the slight mistakes that came his way. And many people out there did do just that. They equated pancritical rationalism with non-dual Eastern philosophy, something that Bartley has obvious affinity for, but is keen to at least show that his philosophy sits outside of, at least in important ways. And it's from that grounding that Bartley moves into speaking about what he really wants to speak about, which is Christianity and the development of Christianity and the eventual retreat to commitment as he saw it within the faith. Now, he begins by saying that it is possible that the three meta-contexts he speaks of, the Western context of justificationism and true belief, the Oriental meta-context of non-attachment, and lastly, the fallibilist meta-context. He thinks that perhaps they met and tangled for a brief while, but parted, as he writes, parted forever at a point in the distant past. But between writing the first draft of the book I have in front of me and the later drafts, something important did happen within the history of Christianity. And as he saw it, a new debate was raging at the time. I think it still is today. Now, Bartley here is speaking about the discovery of the Gnostic Gospels. Now, I think the Gnostic Gospels were, in fact, discovered before Bartley wrote his book, or at least around the time. But what Bartley is talking about here is, of course, the translations that came with them and the debates that followed. So in 1945, somewhere in Upper Egypt, an earthenware jar is discovered, containing papyrus texts that date back to the early centuries of the Christian era, as early, in fact, as the documents of the New Testament. These are Coptic translations, of course, of Greek originals. And as Bartley goes on to say, they effectively challenge the picture of the historical Jesus and the conception of the God that was championed so heavily by the movement within Christianity to shift back to that retreat to commitment, the one that Bartley regrets so much. The movement before these documents were discovered, before the Gnostic Gospels, looked upon the idea of discovery of self, that is man himself, as something that sits beyond conceptions and philosophies and all cultural creations. Man cannot discover what God is. Rather, it can only be revealed to him through authority and revelation, of course. The Gnostic Gospels, however, offer something different, and in fact go far beyond anything that was within that liberal Protestant tradition that was trying to reform the church in a rationalist mode. These Gospels are deeply individualistic in many ways. They want to start with the supremacy of the individual, and they champion self-knowledge, and that this knowledge of the world and of themselves is an important starting point for then discovering knowledge of God. Bartley quotes a particular passage here from those Gospels, which goes on to say, "Look for him by taking yourself as a starting point. Learn who is within you, who makes everything his own. Learn the sources of sorrow and joy and hate and love." And these Gnostic Gospels go on to have a strong hint of Hinduism, Buddhism to them, non-dualism. In fact, Bartley goes on to speculate that they were in fact influenced by these traditions. The Gospel of Thomas, of course, which is one of the chief Gnostic writings, is named after a disciple who in fact travelled to India These Gospels still speak about the role that suffering has within Christian life, how it is an impact of ordinary human experience. It's an illusion of a kind and a nightmare, something that needs to be overcome and will be overcome. But where it differs slightly is it offers a route out as well, not simply through coming to God, not simply through blind faith, but through practice, through discipline, meditative practice, ascetic practices, and interior spiritual search, after which enlightenment is possible, and the discovery of God as well. Self-knowledge, the important point is a way towards the discovery of God and the universe in which we live. Now, we don't want to misstate things here. The Gnostic Gospels are distinctly Christian. They talk about at length the need to reject the creeds of other orthodoxies, other faiths, other hierarchies, other authorities, other rituals, but they do so in a slightly different way, a way that would shift the meta-context of Christianity, or at least would have. They deny the literal understanding of the virgin birth. They deny the real physical suffering of Christ on the cross, as well as the literal bodily resurrection of Jesus, and also the coming of the kingdom of God to earth. This is all dismissed as the phrase that Bartley used here is the faith of fools and magical thinking. What the Gnostics deny and what the Gnostics leave out and reject are precisely those beliefs that are most incredible, the ones that require the more irrational commitments, the more conformity to authority, and the support of those authorities within Orthodox tradition. The Gnostics see things rather differently. A lot of this is symbolic or metaphorical. For example, they change the meaning of the Christian story of resurrection as one that is achievable through enlightenment, not through blind faith, and that the kingdom of God is already here on earth with us. It is a state of, and this is the quote, transformed consciousness. And Jesus is not someone who stands over his disciples, but simply a teacher, someone who leads them towards greater understanding of themselves and the world, not towards blind faith. And yet there's an important difference here, and the meta-context that the Gnostic Gospels sit in is a tricky one to quite understand. The important distinction between them and the Buddhist tradition, other than the dates and the historical record, is that the Gnostic Gospels don't really advocate for any form of relativism or rabid skepticism or indifference to the formulations of truth as they're done by human beings. They are fallibilistic, these Gnostic Gospels, but in an advocacy for progress towards the truth and a process that gets us there through reason. The Gospels teach, in Bartley's phrase, a storming of the citadel, an encouragement and a disputation, an attitude to go beyond what is taught and improve upon the teaching of even the apostles themselves. The deepest of tradition within the Christian faith is one that can be improved upon. Of course, this is distinctly marked against the orthodox traditions on the other side. Deeply justificationist critics who insist that they want no type of disputation, no claim to understand or to possess the knowledge of Christ, no inquiry after the gospel itself, but simply faith and blind faith. The Gnostic gospel is an entirely different type of sensibility, and here Bartley speaks about a particular Gnostic writer. This is Sylvanus, and he says, and I'll read the quote here, that when you listen to Sylvanus, he sounds incredibly Socratic. So here's the quote: "A foolish man goes the way of desire in every passion. He swims in the desires of life and has found it. He is like a ship which has the wind tossed to and fro, and like a loose horse which has no rider. For this one needed the rider, which is reason. Before everything else, you know. The mind is the guide, but reason is the teacher. Enlighten your mind, light the lamp within you." Now, when Bartley is making comment on this, he does recognize that the Gospels are relatively new documents. They're complicated and difficult, and scholars have only recently have access to them, and interpreting them is a vast enterprise. And he doesn't want to give the impression that there is one clear Gnostic teaching. And even if there was, he doesn't want to advocate for that teaching. He is not endorsing his readers to become Gnostic Christians. But what he does want to show is that the challenge that faced liberal Christians, liberal Protestants, would have been one that would have been radically different. And the challenges that he wrote about in the early chapters of his book would have been much easier barriers to overcome. The strength of the Reform movement against the neo-Orthodox tradition would have had a unique kind of importance behind it now, a unique kind of allied document to support it. And he said if the Gnostic Gospels may have existed at the time, it may have in fact changed and saved Protestant liberalism and changed this meta-context. Now, of course, they weren't available. And the debate played out very differently. But as Bartley says, he simply wants to remind the reader that these meta-contexts would have been different, or could have been different, and that there was perhaps once a moment within the history of Christianity where the whole thing might have gone very differently. A different direction might have been taken. and that this literature of lost causes, as he calls it, which is the Gnostic Gospels, might have been crucial not just in shaping the development of Christianity, but the development of rationality itself and of the whole Western society. The justificationism that he sniffed out so well within the philosophy around him and within rationalism may not have been there. He says perhaps what would have been instead would have been a more boundless type of vision. Instead, of course, the Orthodox churches crushed Gnosticism, and this potential for an undogmatic kind of Christianity was indeed lost forever. And it means in many ways that the Christianity that we have in front of ourselves today is a limited type, one which relies on only the available sources, and that would be those sources that were compatible and agreeable enough to survive what he calls the book burnings and the persecution of the heretics. It is nothing but remarkable luck that despite being so incredibly successful at doing just this, at wiping out those alternative traditions, that 1600 years after it was buried, someone would discover that single earthenware jar in a mound of soft soil. And we can now look back and perhaps look at the history of Christianity and imagine that the type that was entrenched within Western thought might have been very different. What we have now is knowledge of a possibility, and we owe it all to perhaps a single monk who buried those papyrus scrolls and gave us the thought of an historical what might have been. So why is Bartley telling us all this? Why is he going into such details about the Gnostic Gospels and about Eastern non-dualism, for example? Because he is trying to create here what he calls an eco-niche for rationality. And he wants to show from the outset, particularly with that example of the Gnostic Gospels, that the job for rationalism, for rationality, is much harder than the job for their enemies is. It's simply much harder, much more difficult proposition to create and to institutionalize this eco-niche, as he calls it, a program that seeks unrelenting growth and constant and deliberate criticism, than it is to create a program on the other side which simply wants to self-perpetuate existing ideas or an existing system of belief. And this is not some minor thing here. Bartley thinks that this eco-niche, this institutionalization, is the whole goal for rationality. It's the main existing problem that exists when it comes to the growth of knowledge. How do we create these eco-niches? In the fabulistic meta-context, the problem before ourselves is how to create the most lethal environment, as he calls it, one where all positions and contexts and meta-contexts thrive and criticize each other, where everything is exposed to as much criticism as possible. Falsification is ramped up as high as is possible, and everything is tested to its absolute conceivable extent. Not to save the lives of existing systems and theories, but have them fight and see which one is the strongest, where nothing and absolutely nothing is protected against falsification, including the principle of falsification itself, which is Bartley's extension on Popper, of course. And of course, it should go beyond simple institutions of science. Of course, Popper did this as well. He stepped it into the political realm himself, particularly through the Open Society and its enemies. And in doing so, twisting the question of what we ought to be asking ourselves, which is, how can we hope to detect error and eliminate error wherever we find it? Now, Bartley twists it ever so slightly, of course, and of course he's focusing a lot more on the institutional level here. And his phraseology is this: how can our intellectual life and institutions be arranged so as to expose our beliefs, our conjectures, our policies, our positions, our sources of ideas, our traditions, and the like, whether they are justifiable or not, to the maximum possible criticism. As nice as it is to imagine that the problem of rationality is one for individuals to handle themselves, and in some ways, of course, it is, rationality can never be completely individualistic. It needs the niche around it, the eco-niche, the ecology. For all that criticism to come about, and for all those new ideas, they're not going to come from one source only, or at least they're very unlikely that it would. And even if we could imagine what an deeply rational individual looks like, someone who has achieved a kind of state of flexibility, as Bartley calls it, a keenness for the truth, the kind of rationality that Bartley writes throughout his book, if you can embed that as much as possible within an individual, well, that individual is still going to be hampered if they live their life within institutions that are not rational institutions. If they live within a justificationistic meta-context, then all the institutions and the traditions by which they operate their lives will have to come about at the expense of rationality. The person they are is going to be in contrast to the world they live in. And of course, these institutions are not benign, they seek to perpetuate themselves, which is why Bartley talks so much about the Gnostic Gospels. And the individuals within these systems who are not working in that same capacity are very likely to find themselves weeded out, or worse. And all the conditions within the individual, or within individuals of such capacity, things like truthfulness, criticism, full communication, acknowledgements of error and corrections of error, acknowledgements of all contributions, all these things will disappear. He goes on to say perhaps this is why throughout the history of humanity where you bump into deeply enlightened figures such as the works in India that he mentioned earlier, that these people tend to separate themselves from mankind and live lives of isolation. Better to be by themselves than to be embedded within a tradition and a meta-context, a justificationist meta-context, which seeks to destroy them. If you can imagine it like this, if you think of a rational individual as someone who seeks the truth and then expresses that truth, then the rational eco-niche, the rational ecology, is one in which truth can be pursued and truth can be spoken. A rationalist eco-niche is one where the creation of all positions, all contexts, and development of all rationality is on the table. Everything is criticizable and expressible. Now these things can be clumsy, and the eradication of error can be clumsy. And in some senses, you don't want it to be simply maximum, you want it to be optimum and applied in intelligent ways. But of course, those ways will be open to criticism, and we'll only discover them through criticism as well. And the size of the eco-niche matters as well. Not only is it for aims and beliefs, conjectures and ideas and ideologies and policies and programs, all these things that we are quite comfortable saying, but it runs deeper. The questions of etiquette and manners and customs and unconscious presuppositions. The problem of rationality is how this can all be done. And it hasn't been helped in the past by people saying the opposite, that it simply can't be done, that there are limitations to rationality, that there are some contexts that can't be challenged, some things that sit beyond fallibilism, some things that we have to assume to be true to then make progress about the world. Bartley goes on to say in the final passage of this appendix that if the argument that he has put forward within his book is true, then we no longer need to take this argument seriously, just as we don't need to take forward the arguments of justificationism or traditional rationality or relativism or authoritarianism or any other type of irrationality. Just how we form the eco-niche itself, this is what he thinks is the problem. This is what he thinks is the central problem for rationality. But he doesn't think that we have to sit back and say it is a problem that cannot be solved, or say at least that it's a problem that can only partially be solved. And he goes on to say in the last sentence of this book, of this appendix, that the following appendices will be preliminary steps towards doing just that. The question won't be resolved, but of course it never will be. The next appendix is called The Logical Strength and Demarcation. And do please join me for the next 5 in the series here, because these are the ones that I believe are most important in the whole book. That question of the eco-niche I think matters, and of course it matters much deeply to Bartley. But if you followed his philosophy and you thought there was something to it, then these next few chapters are the ones where criticism really does come his way, and where some potential problems are presented back at Bartley, some that seem difficult to handle, and some where I believe Bartley slightly changes his mind on a few things. Not the central premise, and not the issue of Popper being wrong, and not the issue of what rationality ought to look like, but just a few details around the fringes of the logic. Anyway, please join us then.